What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Spark to Fire. I'm your host, Landon Rhodes, and today I've got the founder of Glacial Till Winery, Mike Murman. Dude, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
This is really exciting, and I've really enjoyed this cider. So he came in first of all with strawberry rhubarb cider. Got a little soft spot for that. For my mom, who I know listens to this, she would make strawberry rhubarb jelly, my mom and my grandma. And you guys hit the flavor profile pretty spot on, I gotta say. So that was really good.
It's a seasonal, so you'll have to wait till next season to get some more.
I'll be there. I'll be there for it. So that's good. No, Mike was nice enough to bring in some delicious cider. If you guys haven't had Glacial Till, this stuff is amazing. You know, I'm not like a huge fan of sugary drinks and what I would normally consider a cider as a sugary drink, but this struck like the perfect balance between like being sweet and having a great taste to it without being too sweet to you're like, oh my gosh, I can't have more than one of these. And I'm sure you guys hear that a lot, but that's what all my friends tell me when they have Glacial Till. So you did a phenomenal job with this.
Well, thank you.
What I find really interesting about this, though, is the fact that this wasn't the first thing that you did, and it wasn't, you had a lot of interesting history all before Glacial Till happened. So I think a lot of people know you for Glacial Till, but I don't know how many people know you for everything before that. So I want to go all the way back to the very beginning, Mike, and tell me a little bit about like who you were as a kid. What was your childhood like?
I had a good childhood. Grew up in a family with good value structure. My parents pretty much instilled in me a good work ethic, treat other people well, and if you want to get ahead in life, you better work. And so, you know, we had plenty of food. We didn't have plenty of money. I learned at a pretty early age that if I wanted to acquire any kind of property, back then it might have been a baseball glove or some tennis shoes, I had to go work and make some money in order to get that. And so early on, I had part-time jobs when I wasn't old enough to work, and I worked my way through college. My parents helped support me in college to the extent I knew they would help me for 4 years, and after 4 years, I needed to graduate or I needed to pay my way.
Leave the nest.
So
what was the first thing, backing up a second here, what was the first thing where you're like, I have to own one of those? Was it like a bicycle? Was it a baseball glove? What was like your first thing where you're like, oh,
I think it was
crap.
a baseball glove.
Yeah. You're like, okay, I have to go make money to earn this.
Yep.
There's a lot of congruency between all of our guests here. They all had like that one thing. I think Jeff Nordhook's was a motorcycle. I think it was a motorcycle. Yeah. And that was his parents said the same thing. Like, you know, we'll take care of you to the extent that we need to, but if you want anything extra, go get it yourself.
Yeah. The bigger item would have been a bicycle.
Yeah.
And then I always begged for a car, but my dad used to always tell me, you can get a car anytime you want. Yeah. You can buy the car, if you can pay the insurance, if you can put the gas in it, you can have it. Mm-hmm. But I never ever got a car until I graduated from college.
I see. So you're graduating from college, and I think you're a UNL grad, right?
Yes, sir.
Gotcha. So what did you study at UNL?
I was in the business college, so mostly management and marketing would have been the concentrations in the business college.
Which one did you like more?
I like them both. I like the people aspect of management. I had a professor there that I really learned a lot from, Dr. Fred Luthans, and he focused a lot on human resources, so the whole human resource management side I was intrigued with. But then I like the creativity of marketing. I used to do my own photography, and so when it comes to marketing, I like the whole aspect of trying to figure out how to position products and your message to fit the people you're trying to market to.
So you enjoyed that at a young age. Mm-hmm. You said, I want to do something like that with your career, and so you left college. And what did you go pursue?
So I actually, in 1978, I would have been a junior in college. I got a internship job with a company by the name of Selection Research. Mm-hmm. At that point in time, Selection Research was largely a startup company that Dr. Don Clifton founded.
From Gallup.
Yep.
Right.
And so I worked in the original company called SRI, and back then there was only a handful of people working there, maybe a couple dozen, if that. We were on the second floor of a building behind the restaurant on 48th Street. I can't remember at that time. I think it was the Topper, but it doesn't matter.
Oh, okay. So this is in Lincoln at the time.
Yep. They were in Lincoln at the time. And the whole time I did work for them, they were in Lincoln. So I started with them as a college intern, learning how to conduct their profile interviews, learning how to code their interviews, ultimately becoming an analyst where I would actually take the results of the interview and write up profiles for their clients about particular candidates that they would be interested in hiring.
So archetyping.
Yeah, behavioral profiling.
Gotcha. So profiling to understand
these are the tendencies of this person, their strengths or their weaknesses, or what style of management they might respond to better, things like that.
Interesting.
And so that fit in with my interest at that time with Dr. Luthon's human resource management. And so they offered me a job full time. After college, I was the director of Talent Center, which is kind of a big title for basically I was a headhunter. So
got it.
They would have clients that needed help with recruiting, with selection, and so I would go in, or people that worked for me would go in and assist clients in recruiting people and helping them select people.
Who are some of the biggest companies you selected for?
Do you have
any
at the time, I can't, Denny's, as far as restaurant companies, large, Golden Corral.
And large, so we're talking the corporate entity that's over all of the franchisees.
Yep. Yeah. So we would have been helping them develop profiles for managers. Or there was a company at the time up in Omaha called Applied Communications, ACI. They were a tech company similar to Fiserv, banking software. So we would recruit salespeople for them, tech salespeople.
Gotcha.
Worked with some different pharmaceutical companies.
What interested you about HR, human resources, and dealing with people so much? Like what drove you to want to get better at that?
I think probably goes back to my sister's a teacher, my dad's a teacher, my wife's a teacher. So I like the aspect of developing people, I guess would be what I like about human resource management. Having people have success, compensating people in a way that they feel like they're being rewarded for their contributions. So I like that aspect of it.
Yeah. And I read something earlier, this is now after all of your ventures, but you're actually advising startups here and there.
Yep.
And are you still doing that today?
Yep.
Yeah. So I'm guessing that plays a big role into it, is helping them understand, hey, this is the kind of person you need to hire, what that looks like. Yeah,
not so much selection anymore. I mean, the one company that I probably have spent the most time with here locally is a software company by the name of Travify.
Yeah.
And so I serve as a mentor in some regards for Chris Davis early on when they were trying out a bunch of different ideas and they needed money. And I always told him, I'm free for advice, but I'd probably be the last guy that would ever put any money in one of your ventures. And part of the reason was in the beginning, I couldn't ever wrap my head around what it was they were doing that they could make money at. And I think in a lot of my advice to him, it's you need a customer, you need somebody paying you. There's too many of these young startups that they think they have great ideas, but nobody's paying them.
Right.
So it's like you need to develop software that somebody's going to pay you for it. And that's when they kind of changed course, like all businesses do, and figured we need to do something different. And that's when Travify got traction. And so they had, at that time, they then put me on as a corporate board advisor, so I'm actually compensated in stock. And they had some room within a capital raise that they didn't need the money anymore, but at that point in time, which in hindsight, it's a good thing they did it because of COVID. But I said, it's it's easy to raise money when you don't need it. And so at that time, I told them I would provide them half of the money that they still could raise so that I could have a greater ownership share in the company. So I meet with them quarterly. They call me if they have questions. So it's turned into more of just a general advisor on business, marketing, people, incentives, whatever.
Yeah, which you obviously know a lot about from not only that, but your next venture, which we're going to get into. So you're at Selection Research Institute. Is that Institute? Is that the I?
Yep, I think so.
So you're at Selection Research, and you leave there, start your own thing.
Yep.
What happens next?
Well, let's start with what happened before that.
Okay.
Like a year or two before I left, I had ideas of developing software. So this is around the beginning of the 80s, and the IBM PC, compact PC, you're finally being able to have a computer on your desk. And I'd read a book called Megatrends that really opened my eyes to data, software, where kind of the future was going, and I felt like I wanted to be involved in software. And so I had brought up a couple ideas I had for personnel selection and software for personnel selection. And at that point in time, that was just not something that Selection Research wanted to hear or wasn't interested in. Around the same time, a friend of mine, close friend of mine, Mike Hayes, left Selection Research and started National Research Corporation here in town, the large healthcare market research company. And him and I continued our friendship and relationship. And being 25 years old at the time and maybe a little bit naive, the people at Selection Research didn't like the fact that I was maintaining a relationship with him, that he was a competitor, and I basically got fired, surprisingly, after having one of my best years, and then rehired in the same day. And the only
rehired in the same day.
And the only thing I had to do to be rehired was to agree that I could not socialize with Mike, and that, we basically had to stop that relationship. Otherwise, they were concerned about, I don't know what. I guess they were concerned that maybe I would be sharing information with them since
Trade
they competed
secrets
or whatever.
Yeah.
But it opened my eyes at that point in time. I'd never been fired before, and especially for something like this.
And you were good at what you did.
And I was having a record year, so it wasn't performance. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of looked in the mirror at that time and thought, I'm never going to feel like this again, and I'm not ever going to get fired by an employer. And I'd always wanted to be my own boss. And then Mike Hayes was pushing me, why don't you go pursue those software ideas that you have? And so finally, I left on my terms. And so I started measurement systems at 26 years old. I left and gave them, basically I quit. And I moved out of my office on the 4th of July weekend. So Independence Day is always the day that I celebrate that I started my entrepreneurial journey at 26, and my wife's pregnant, and I had my first son 7 days later.
Hold on. So you quit your job? You quit your job knowing that you had a son on the way. How many, would you say 7 days later?
Yep.
What'd she say?
Well, my wife knew because I was clearly dissatisfied after the firing and rehiring. And so
she was probably on your side at that point.
Yeah, and so it wasn't just like a random decision. It'd been a decision that we'd talked about for over a year, and a lot of, pushing, do it. And finally it came down to, when you're 26 years old, what do you have to lose? I mean, if if it doesn't work out, if I go broke, they don't put you in jail for going broke. Mm-hmm. So it's like, let's try it. My parents, on the other hand, thought I was nuts. It's like, you've got a good job, you're working for a good company, you're making good money.
You have a child
on the way. You're like, do you know what you're doing?
Right.
Which I probably didn't at the time.
But that's the beauty of it, right?
That's how it works out, yeah.
So Independence Day, you leave, you start your own thing.
Yep.
And it is not easy after that point, as it should be. Like, you would think that you would have this renewed sense of independence, but things don't work out that way for you.
That's right. In the beginning, it worked out okay. The software and the product that I had developed was gaining traction to the extent that there were clients that were wanting to leave selection research and go with me. And I think that then became kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. They'd had other people like Mike Hayes and other people who had been there that had left and started competing businesses, but they had not sued them. Mm-hmm. So they decided that it was time to make a case out of someone. So I got to be that case. So I didn't get sued initially. I want to say it was maybe about 6 months after I started, but they filed a trade secret case against me, claiming that what it was that I was doing was stolen from them, that it was their trade secrets. So unfortunately for me, there were restraining orders, there were injunctions. I couldn't actively go out and grow the business, so I slowly was dying.
Right. And so their lawsuits actually worked.
They worked.
In that regard.
They worked because I believe measurement systems would have been a highly successful business. You can look at people, Bill Anstein, Troy Cantor, people that left after me that were doing what I was doing a decade before them.
Right.
So
you knew the market was there.
The market
was there because you were in the market.
I was in the market. I understood it, and I was one of the first looking at developing software for human resources and selection and various management purposes.
How long did it last?
Measurement systems stayed in business until '94. So
I meant your like lawsuit though.
Oh,
it was long.
It was long. It ran from 1984 to 1989.
5 years.
5 years.
And how often are you meeting in a courtroom?
There was the original trial. There were two trials. It was a bifurcated trial. So the initial part, the first trial, was on whether or not they had a trade secret, a protectable trade secret, and whether or not I was knowledgeable of it. And so at the end of the first trial, basically the conclusion was, yes, they have a protectable trade secret. Yes, Mike Murman knew about their technologies and how they worked. So the second part of the bifurcated trial was, did Mike Murman profit from this knowledge? And so by the end of that trial, they had not been able to prove that I had profited from any of their trade secret knowledge. And the reason was because in court, I had put on a case that all of the technology we had independently developed. So I didn't use anything of theirs. Right. I used techniques I learned there, but I didn't use their products. Yeah. So they got a $0 damage verdict.
Ruling in Mike Murman's favor.
Right. So they did not like that. So they appealed it to the Supreme Court. And since they appealed it to the Supreme Court, we filed a counterclaim that there shouldn't have been a finding of trade secrets in the first part, so there should have never been a trial on damages. So at the Supreme Court level, they ruled in my favor that the original first part of the bifurcated trial was in error.
In error, yeah. And so
I never did take anything. I never did pay any money. But by the time it was done, I had legal bills in excess of 6 figures. It took me another 5 years or so after that to pay off my legal bills. It successfully, kept measurement systems from becoming a viable competitor to them. But at the same time, as things so happen, because of that, I stumbled across the idea of what Pinlink was in 1986.
We're going to get into that in a second.
Okay.
I'm just going to wrap this up a little bit. What in the world were your parents thinking at this time? Were they 100% supportive of like, hey, this is what you got to do? We believe in everything. Or were they like, was there a moment where they were like questioning you? Like, did you
I'm
take
probably
something?
not like a child that asked my parents for like a lot of feedback or advice.
You just kind of
I tend to be more independent, and I tend to go about doing what I feel I need to do independent of what they're suggesting.
Right. I'm very much similar to that.
So it was very difficult. The 80s were very hard. My wife was a teacher. She was working full time. I couldn't always pay all the bills. So, you would defer different bills as long as you could. I'd pay my employees first, and if there wasn't enough money, I wouldn't pay myself.
Yep.
Because of the stress of the lawsuit, I was breaking fillings in my teeth at night, grinding my teeth, so I would have to wear a plastic mouth guard to keep me from breaking my teeth. So it was a dark period.
Yeah. What did you do to cope with that? Did you just because I know a lot of people
drink cider. No.
Drink cider. Yeah. That's what they need to do now, right, Mike?
Yeah.
But it might not be hard enough. But what really at that time though, I know a lot of people have gone through COVID right now, and some of them going through really tough times. What advice do you have for anybody that's going through, some really hard shit that,
just persevere. And don't quit. My whole thing was I always felt like if I quit at any stage of the process, they would win. That their takeaway would be, he actually stole something from us. When I knew I didn't. I didn't ever want. For me, I would rather go broke than have someone accuse me of stealing something when I knew I didn't do that. So it was very important to me personally, and really for my business career, to not have that hung on me that, I'm going to see this thing through because I didn't do what they said I did, and I can't live with that, type of a verdict if I settle out of court or if I quit and say, all right, I'm going to close the company. So it was very important for me to see it through and see it through the way it ended.
So that was from 26 to 31?
Yeah.
Imagine that, guys. You're starting a company, you're kicking ass, you're kicking ass at another job, and then you start another company with your buddy who's also ends up being extremely successful.
Yeah, I think in my high school reunion at 30 years old or something, they kind of asked, what are you doing or whatever, and I put scratching out a living.
Scratching out a living. You're doing a lot more than that now, so that ended up working out for you. But imagine that. You're 26 years old, guys, and I'm 27 right now. And so the thought of getting hit with a massive lawsuit that's going to derail me for 5 years, that's a really tough thing to think about. And so I applaud you for persevering through that, because not only did you get, drained of resources during that time, I have a feeling you kind of got backed into a bit of a corner.
Oh yeah.
And what happens to creative entrepreneurial thinkers when they get backed into a corner is they basically just drill a hole in the wall or punch through it and find a new thing.
Yep.
And that's what I want to talk about next. Is so you had these software engineers, you had developers they needed stuff to do, right?
Right.
And you guys see this contract, and I'll let you kind of tell the story, but I think it's interesting that it started with someone that you needed a job for them to kind of fill.
Right. Yeah. So I think we went from around 20, 25 employees in 94 or not 94, 84 to around 4 employees around 87. And I was going out and selling contract programming services basically. And that was a way that we could do something that would create revenue. And so the Lincoln Police Department has a program called Santa Cop, and they needed someone to develop some software to basically match their toy inventory they had donated to requests that kids had, and then find deficiencies where kids are requesting something that they don't have toys for. And so we did that for them. And then when we got done, like all good salespeople, is there anything else we can do for you?
Right.
And the people that I was dealing with at the time were white-collar crime investigators. And they said, well, we don't have any more projects for you, but we have a need. And the need is, we think that the collection of data from this pen register could be automated. And if somebody figured out software to automate pen register investigations, we think they'd make a lot of money because there's nobody that's doing this right now. So at that point in time, being in a situation where I'm looking for something else to do in the software world, you want to develop a product that everybody's looking for and nobody's made it.
Do you even know what a pen register was at this point?
No.
So this guy's basically speaking Vietnamese to you, and some sort of, we need this thing. You have no idea what he's talking about.
And that's pretty much what I said. I don't know what a pen register is, and I don't know what you do, but I'm all about making software that everybody needs.
Yeah. And can you yourself code?
No.
I love that. I'm always interested by people that they have enough experienced professionals around them, specifically developers, because it's like looking at a different language. But you knew you could find people you could trust to make things happen.
Yeah, I knew enough about software and software development that I always, in the early stages, and again, running a business for 3 decades, it obviously gets very different. But in the beginning, I knew quite a bit about PCs. I knew quite a bit about the operating systems. I knew what you could do with them. Mm-hmm. And so I served more as an architect. I knew what the customer needed. I knew what an intuitive interface should look like, but I would draw it on paper. I didn't code it. And so then I would then serve as kind of the dumb user, like, all right, you guys code this, and then I'll give you feedback on whether it's easy enough for non-computer people to run. And then in the early stages, I wrote the technical manuals, I did the training. So I was technically proficient, but I didn't write code.
But you're not a coder. Yeah. So he tells you he needs this thing.
Yep.
I need this pen register automation software, and you say, okay, sure, we'll go build it.
Yep. And basically what happened was these 2 gentlemen did invest a small amount of money, and the kind of agreement was we would pay them royalty on this product that we helped develop for the Lincoln Police Department. So that's what we did. And so we developed a piece of software that became what we called PenLink at the time. And PenLink was a product of Measurement Systems. And so basically what we did was we took what was a manual process at the time and automated it, and allowed them to collect in real time data from a pen register device, which is a type of wiretap, and collect it in a database, and then provide post-collected analytics. And back in that time frame, I want to say there was 8 to 10 manufacturers of these pen register devices, their hardware. Mm-hmm. And they're proprietary. So each of these different companies had their own data formats. Each of them had their own clients. And only 2 of these 10 were dabbling in software at the time. And it was proprietary software. It only worked with theirs. So I realized very early on, we're not going to compete with the hardware people. We just want to do the software part. And so we developed the software to automate it for the Lincoln Police Department. But I quickly realized that what we made for them was for a particular type of pen register that wasn't widely used. And the type of investigation that we coded was largely for a gambling investigation that they were doing. I went to a trade show in Orlando and quickly realized that there's other manufacturers of these devices, and most of the federal agencies use another kind of a brand. But I also learned that there wasn't any software. And so we went about making sure early on our software interfaced with everybody's proprietary device. So what that did was gave large federal agencies the ability to collect proprietary data and normalize it. So now they could do analytics on telephone data being collected on various proprietary platforms. For the Lincoln Police Department, we did a time study on that first gambling case, and we reduced some basic analytics that they would do by hand from 40 hours to about a minute or two.
Oh my gosh.
So I knew then in the late 80s that the kind of productivity that we could provide to law enforcement and intelligence agencies and the level of analytics, predictive analytics that they could do was far superior than anything they were doing. And I had a much greater runway with a stickier product than measurement systems.
So what sort of analytics are you pulling? Like, give us an idea of like a line of the data.
Well, like just think of your phone bill.
Right.
So a PIN register is a wiretap that collects all the metadata about a call, but not the content. So everything that happens up to the point you get connected, so date of the call, time of the call, duration of the call,
tower
number
bounce.
dialed. Yeah, there weren't towers in the 80s, but yeah.
But
but later on,
But
yes.
eventually you did.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
and that was a part of it,
The thing
right?
is, when I started, it was analog phone networks.
Right.
Very easy to tap.
Follow the wire.
Very basic. And so a lot of times people are like, well, how about the growth in PinLink? Well, we didn't get into full-blown wiretapping platforms until after 2000. So, for over a decade, we were very specialized in telephone data collection, telephone data analytics, and the court term for that is a PIN register. And that's where PinLink comes from. PinLink, so a PIN register, link analysis. And so a lot of the use of our product in those time periods were for drug investigations. And they don't need to listen to the conversations to be able to develop data about who's networked. I mean, you look at phone traffic.
That's wild.
Who calls who, when they call
that's
who.
cool.
So
I can see the map
I
now.
could
I
tell
get it.
you who your friends are. I
Yeah.
could tell you when you do things. I could tell where you go. And so it became a highly successful product for all law enforcement agencies, but specifically the DEA. And so I think it was in 94 that the DEA entered into a global software license with us. And that's when I closed Measurement Systems.
Closed it.
Yep. Mothballed it. So it was still going. It made money, but it wasn't a part of my focus since '89. I never ever did anything really with it after the lawsuit was over.
You wanted to make sure it was a separate entity as well, because you didn't want it tied to any of the negativity around the lawsuit, just in case they would dig something
in
up.
'87, after a year of working on PinLink, my lawyer advised me to put it into its own entity. That way, if Measurement Systems got shut down, this was its own different thing.
Mm-hmm. Can't pierce that corporate veil. So that's very interesting. I didn't, because I forgot about the networking aspect, and I didn't realize that you weren't taking content of calls. So it's not necessarily like, hey, I'm not into drugs, so I don't know what the actual language would be, but say I got an 8-ball of this or that, you wouldn't actually capture like what they're saying. It was just the fact that you were networking consistent communication between individuals that leads to building really like you're like unveiling a drug empire.
Right. Yeah.
So you guys are like looking behind the curtain and seeing who's all connected in these areas. That is insane.
Yeah, we weren't, but our clients were.
But your clients were. Yeah.
We had the technology and we trained them how to use it. But yeah, they would use telecommunication data to understand social networks, patterns, time of day. We didn't need conversations to do any of that.
Think about that for a second, guys. All of this information is at what year is this now? When that was just started?
Well, we started, providing, we had a global license with the DEA in 94.
94.
So wherever the DEA conducted casework, they had our software.
Interesting. And so that continues to grow. And I read somewhere that you had $182 million in government contracts from 2007 to 2019. Does that sound right?
I don't know. I mean, I left there in 2013, so I can't I can't verify anything before. But when I was there, we did business with almost all the large federal agencies: DEA, Secret Service, U.S. Marshals, Postal Service, U.S. Customs, most of the large states, most of the large municipalities. We're in multiple foreign countries, pretty much throughout the Caribbean, Central, South America. By the time I left, wherever there's a nexus of drugs, terrorist activity, or criminal organizations, you'll find the DEA.
Right. And then in the process,
you'll find PenLink.
You'll find PenLink. And so you guys created an acronym, which I thought was pretty interesting, for Lincoln. I forgot what the acronym actually said, but I remember.
Local Intercept Network Collection Online Network.
Right.
And so the whole thing behind Lincoln was in 1994, the government passed a law called CALEA, which is an acronym, Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act. And so what government was realizing is with wireless communications, and then later on with digital wireless communications, the old way of conducting pen register and wiretap investigations would not work. Mm-hmm. They were not analog networks.
Right.
And so I realized at that time that the future of doing both pen registers and wiretaps was to be able to interface with switches. And so if you think of a pen register device as a intercept device that is getting both data and content and then sending it to your software, it's not that much different than interfacing with a phone switch.
Right.
It sends you data and content.
Mm-hmm.
And so because we were experts at developing interfaces, unlike a lot of the pen register companies, we set about to create a complete wiretapping platform, not only the pen register data, but the content. And so that's the voice recordings, doing things that will hold up in court. But all of this technology is new. So 2000 is when the law is supposed to take effect. We were the only company that had a product in the country that could actually do a CALEA-based intercept. And we put in a system ahead of the Salt Lake Olympics, or the Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, and the Salt Lake County District Attorney's Office was the purchaser of that, and they needed it in the event they had to go up on VoiceStream, which was a wireless service provider at that time.
Okay.
If something happened during the Olympics. And so we provided that system, and it was the first in the country that actually had the capability to do full-blown wiretaps on wireless phones.
Full-blown wiretaps on wireless phones. What did it feel like to be at the cutting edge of that?
Exciting.
Yeah.
Because, our market, keep in mind now, I've been doing the pen register side of wiretaps from 86 to almost 2000. So our sales they're growing, but the people who made pen registers back in those days, they would get $7,000 for one hardware device that would tap one phone.
Oh my gosh.
Back then nobody valued software, so they didn't want to pay me $100. They're like, we paid $7,000 for this device,
right.
And so we're like, all right, well, can't you pay $1,000 for the software? But then what happened was, as technology changed and everything transferred from analog to digital, there was no need for those hardware devices. And we looked at it as now we can do the actual wiretaps and the content, and that's where the big money was. And
right.
So rather than selling $1,000 piece of software, we're now selling $100,000, $250,000, $1 million intercept systems.
Right.
And so in the late stages of my career at PenLink, we were installing large wiretapping platforms that could do everything, anything that was being communicated. By the end, it was packet data, which is what the internet is.
Mm-hmm. And to this day, do you have any case that you remember that you guys were a part of to where it was like a high profile case that was a lot of fun and exciting to be a part of?
Well, the highest profile case was the Scott Peterson case.
I read a little bit about that, yeah.
And the reason it was so significant is you got to realize that around the time that this was all happening, how wiretaps were being done was completely new. All of the types of wiretap cases historically were done on analog networks, and so the case history and how that stuff works was pretty well laid out. But this case was questioning the technology, and Mark Garagos, who's a big-time celebrity lawyer, was his attorney, and we were subpoenaed to testify in that case. And they were trying to discredit the platform and the evidence, because they wanted it thrown out because it was obviously very damning. And so we had a competitor at the time that had sent out to all the attorney generals in the U.S. that if they had our system, they maybe would want to stop using it because we're being challenged in court. And they're going to probably find that our system did not handle evidence correctly, and any of your cases will never hold up in court. We had a gag order. We could not talk about the case publicly. And so myself and one of my engineers spent a better part of the year traveling to most of the states and having private meetings with the attorney generals to explain to them, we cannot tell you what's happening, but the rumor is not true, and when this is all done, you'll be fine. So it was very significant for us, because if that evidence would have got thrown out in that case, all of the big platform sales that we made after that would have never happened.
You would have lost everything.
Yep.
So did you for a second think maybe our competitors were right?
No.
You knew from the very beginning that was just a rumor.
Yeah. I mean, without getting into the weeds on it, the way our platforms work was the same way that everybody else worked. Anybody that was trying to develop this technology at that time, they all worked the same. So,
and that competitor was just trying to steal some market share.
Yep.
Did not work.
Didn't work for him at all, and it backfired for him, basically. Yeah.
Backfired.
Yep.
And what was the verdict of the case? Obviously, he
was guilty. Yeah. It's been in the news here recently, but it has nothing to do with the integrity of the evidence. It's other kind of procedural things. But yeah, he was found guilty. He was sentenced to death, but they've since, that's the things that are in the news now, that I think he may not, they're going to maybe re-sentence him, but he's guilty. It's just kind of a matter of whether it's death or life in prison.
Yeah, and your platform helped make that happen. That's got to feel good in a sense, because it's not like your platform is biased one way or another, or like it decides someone's fate. It just gives you the most raw, truest form of evidence possible.
Yep, it's data.
Yeah, it's the real stuff. So it's 2003, and you decide that something else needs to start up too. And are you still in at this point?
Well, yeah. So I'm trying to think date-wise. I would have been 48. I got diagnosed with cancer. I had melanoma. And so my oldest son was senior in high school. And around that time, I'd had multiple offers over the years to merge or be bought out. A company by the name of Overwatch was doing a roll-up strategy, and they wanted Pinlink to be a part of that. So I went to New York City, met with a bunch of people. They offered me $40 million, and I'm kind of like, I'm not sure that I want to do this. And so when I And I thought the company was worth more than that. And at that time, they told me, well, Pinlink looks a lot like Mike Murman. And I'm kind of like, well, what's that mean? And they're like, well, you have a very successful company. Your financials are unbelievable. But we're worried about what would happen with the business if you're not there, because you just don't have the corporate structure and the depth in place. And I always prided myself on running a lean entrepreneurial group, no more people than we needed. And I realized that two things. One, I own a company that's very valuable, but it would be greatly discounted if I die from melanoma. And I need to have an exit strategy, because if you own 100% of a company, you're not going to run it forever. And so you never get your value out of it unless you exit. And so I thought about this Overwatch opportunity as a possible exit strategy, but I just didn't like the terms. I didn't like the idea of working for somebody else, and I figured I'll just keep doing this. And then on the plane ride home, I sat with Jim Krieger, who I had worked with back at Selection Research. He was their accountant back then, and by now he's like the CFO of Gallup, and he was president of International, or I'm not sure what all of his titles were, but clearly a key figure in Gallup. And we're sharing with him why I was in New York City, and sharing with him some of the personal stuff of how I might exit. And he was the one who brought up to me, you should look into an ESOP, an employee stock ownership program. So I told him I didn't really know a lot about that. So he set up a meeting. I went up to Omaha, chatted with him. He introduced me to some bankers. And then that got me thinking about, an ESOP might be a good exit strategy. I don't need to sell all of my shares. I'm selling them to my employees. And at that same time, I had bought the land that became Glacial Till Vineyard. And so at that point in time, it was nothing other than an 80-acre farm parcel. And we planted a handful of grapevines so that I could pursue my home winemaking hobby.
Gotcha. So you end up doing this ESOP program, and you do a buyout period, I believe, right? It was like a 6-year buyout period?
What I did was, I think the ESOP got set up in 2007, and the minimum size of an ESOP is 30%. So I did the smallest amount. So at that point in time, I still owned 70% of the stock.
Okay.
And so an ESOP is like a retirement type program. So the longer that you stay at a company, every year you get issued shares of the company. But I'd always treated my employees like owners. I'd done dollar for dollar matching on 401ks up to $15,000. It was important to me that I took care of my people. And so the biggest struggle I always had in selling the business is I knew if I sold it to an outsider, they would change it, they might move it, and so I struggled with that. And so I saw the ESOP as the best way for me to turn the business over to the people that helped me build it. And without fully committing that I'd exit all the way. But I clearly wanted to exit. And then I went about hiring a president, putting 3 people in place as vice presidents, and started making the company not look so much like Mike Murman.
Right.
And with the full understanding that I'm going to exit, whether I sell the 70% to an outsider, whether I, 100% go ESOP. What I ended up doing as a part of rewarding that executive group was gave them incentives to purchase, I think it was around 15% of stock from me. So the employees in general were getting stock, my executive group was getting stock, and by the time I left, I think I owned 51%, and I sold that to the ESOP.
Gotcha. Oh, so all of it ended up going?
All of it ended up in the ESOP, short of the handful of shares I sold to my senior management group.
Got it. Okay. Interesting. And so really giving back to them, clearly giving them a huge opportunity. And then what happened after that point? Did they end up, what happens in an organization like that? How does that work after you leave?
Well, the nice thing is because I knew who the buyer was, I could set up my terms. So in a lot of situations, when an outsider buys you, they may not pay you the full amount up front. You might have some terms or conditions that if you don't hit certain benchmarks, they're going to claw back some of the sale price. Clauses. So my terms were cash on closing because it came down to the executive group wanted to know what my intentions were, and they wanted to know if they could buy more stock from me. And I'm like, I'm not going to go below 51%. So no. And right. If you can come up with money to buy me out on my terms, then we can strike a deal. And so that's what happened. So 2012, it took about a year to get the deal put together. But it was pretty much, here's my terms and here's my price. And they were able to, the executive group was able to go and find the financing to execute the final buyout.
That's really cool. And so how many employees did you have at that point when you guys left? Or when you left?
I want to say around 40, 50, I'm not quite sure. They really, for the next year or two after I left, there was a lot of business in the pipeline. And so they continued to have some pretty good growth after I left, but I haven't been there. I don't see the financials, so sure. I don't know.
Yeah. That's got to feel really good, though, knowing that you built something, gave it back, and gave them an opportunity to have ownership in something really big and really special. And so after that point, you leave, and winemaking is something that has always interested you?
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to college days. Right after college, I got into making wine. Then I got into making homebrew, and then I had kids, and so gotcha. most of the hobbies went out the window, right. And so I got away from it, and so then I started seeing all the vineyards popping up in Nebraska.
James Arthur.
Yep, and I like good food. I like good wine. I had the luxury of traveling all over the world and being able to experience both. So I thought, as a late stage career, I'd like to maybe start up a winery. And so I started looking for land that I thought would be suitable for a vineyard, and stumbled across the location where Glacial Till is now, and bought that in a land auction from the NRD, the National Resource District. And again, it was in the beginning just a place close to Lincoln. I could take my boys out to go hunting, and we'd plant some grapes and make some wine.
And it's a phenomenal hunting spot. I've seen it. I've been there, and I'm sure you.
There were no roads or buildings when I bought it.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm sure, but it was still like if you had any sort of location up on that hill, that'd be a good spot. So, so you guys go there, and this is something exciting for you and your boys to do. You said, and so you walk on this plot of land. And how do you make a decision about where the trellises are going to go, or anything along those lines? Trellises, right? Did I say that right? Okay.
Well, for several years, I'd been going to wineries, studying what wineries look like. I was a member of the Nebraska Grape Growers and Winery Association, so I would go to their workshops and try to learn about growing grapes. And so a couple of the things about the viticulture, which is the science side of growing grapes, they don't like wet feet. And what that means is you don't want to plant them in low areas where water collects. So if you think about where you see vineyards, they're on hillsides. If you see what vineyards are planted in, a lot of times it's rocky, sandy, what would appear to be crappy soil to a row crop farmer in Nebraska.
Right. Yeah, not
great. So grapes like well-drained soil, which means they're typically on hillsides, and they like sandy, rocky kind of soil that drains well. And so that's what I was looking for. Now, the orientation of our vineyard, the hillside slopes north. It would be better if it sloped south, but you've got
it worked out.
It works out. And the other reason you want them on a hillside, and especially in Nebraska, is cold air settles. So when you're dealing with either frost or freeze issues in the spring or fall, some of the early farmers here in Nebraska that planted vineyards planted them down in the valley. Well, I've got this lowland area here that nothing, it's not good for our row crops. We'll put a vineyard down there.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't grow well. They had disease. They were the first to get frosted. Mm-hmm. And so you want to try to keep the vineyard on the upper 2/3 of a hillside.
Gotcha. And so you knew a little bit about it going into it, but then you guys continued to grow grapes and continue to build this brand. And did you kind of tap back into your marketing mind a little bit? And obviously you had lots of business experience and growing a brand, several brands at that point. But as far as your marketing goes, like did you, how much involvement did you have in the actual marketing of?
In the early days, quite a bit.
Yeah.
I liked the creative side of designing labels and in the actual winemaking process is somewhat of an art,
Mm-hmm.
So I liked the creative side of that in the early stages. I would have taught my oldest son what I knew, which wasn't a lot. He went on and took classes from UC Davis in enology and got a certificate from UC Davis in winemaking. So
wow.
From a chemistry, scientific standpoint, he's run circles around me. So, I got out of that part
pretty quickly.
Very quickly.
Yeah.
And then I still was fairly involved in the marketing aspect of it until my youngest son came on. And then he's really taken over that. So all of the branding for Glacial Till, cider is his work product. I have opinions about all that thing, but like with a lot of organizations, as you get other people that are specializing in other areas, I let them run with that. And I have my opinions about whether I like something or not, but it's just one of the opinions that weighs in on it.
Right. That's very cool. And what's the startup cost associated with starting a vineyard?
It depends how big you want to be. There's two things. We started as a winery. It's very expensive. We start with root stock, so every plant could be $2 to $5. Mm-hmm. We might have a few thousand of them, and then you've got the posts and the wires, and then you don't harvest that vine for 2 to 3 years, so you've got a couple, 3 years that you really are just growing grapes and cutting the clusters off so that the plant develops. And then we finally got to the point that we're making wine. We realized pretty quickly, though, we had to do other things. You can be a small mom and pop winery in Nebraska, and it's a lifestyle. Right. And you don't need as much money to do that. If you're going to employ other people, if it's going to be a family business where you want your sons to have, a good career and a good opportunity, you got to grow it and you've got to expand it. So there's not really a good middle ground. Fortunately for us, I have the capital, and my son that started in the beginning, he would always be worried about the costs, and I just kept reminding him, you just worry about making high quality wine.
Right.
The rest will take care of itself. But if you make crappy wine,
we're
not going to be able to sell it. So we're going to lose money for a while here. That's not the end game. So we tried a lot of different things, but a couple things we landed on. Fermented Fridays, we started to host events. So all of a sudden we're, start with 50, 100 people, and we think that that's great. A year ago, before COVID, we were averaging 500 to 700 people on a Friday night.
500 to 700?
So we'd have live music, we'd have food trucks.
Oh my gosh.
So you'd start to see, we're in the wine business, but we're really in the event business.
Right. Whatever gets the people there to drink the wine business.
Exactly. So, and you'll see that a lot of the successful wineries in the state, they're just not making wine because it's too competitive. If you go into a liquor store, there's thousands of brands, and Nebraska is not considered a wine state. And so you've got to overcome, the perception that you can't make good wine in Nebraska, which isn't true. And then you're competing with all of the other brands, and most people only can name 2 or 3 varieties, and they're all California or West Coast grapes. Mm-hmm. Those don't grow here. So So you're not
I don't know
only
why this doesn't
dealing
grow
with,
here.
you
Or
know,
it doesn't
oh, you
grow.
don't have a Cabernet?
Yeah.
No, that doesn't grow here. Yeah.
We don't have those.
But
you have
I have a Marquette.
Marquette and
Yeah.
I think Edelweiss.
Chamberson, Edelweiss, yeah.
Yep.
So anyway, that was a struggle. And then the big turning point came in 2014 in Nebraska as a farm winery. At that time, you had to use 75% Nebraska-grown grapes. So unlike some of the surrounding states that don't have that restriction, they'll bring in grapes or juice from California. They'll have Cabernets in Kansas. Well, they didn't grow those there. No. So we lost all of our crop in 2014 due to a spring frost and freeze. So we had no grapes to make anything with.
Does that happen all in one day? Is that just one?
Pretty much overnight.
Just one frost overnight.
If it happens at the right time. And then sometimes the grapevines will put out what they call secondary buds, but you'll get half or less of the crop. So we're worried about sustainability. What are we going to do? And that's when my youngest son came up with the idea, hey, maybe we should look at making hard cider. We could get some apple cider from Kimmel Orchard. You know, we could make it. We know how to, hard cider is wine. It's carbonated wine, basically.
Right.
And so we got 500 gallons of cider from Kimmel, and we fermented it, made what is now our original cider. And at that time, because of the events that we were having, a beer distributor was out there bringing us some beer, and we said, hey, you want to try this cider we made? And they're like, we'll take all of it. And we're like, no, it's not for sale. But if you guys are serious, then next year, which would have been 2015, then we'll start making it for you. And so that would have been K&Z Distributors here in Lincoln. And so they encouraged us to go down the path of making hard cider, and they would distribute it for us in their territory.
And they're a huge distributor in Lincoln. You guys have drank a beer in Lincoln. Chances are a lot of it.
And they were also good about pushing craft beers. So, their portfolio of brands were more so craft-centric than, say, Budweiser or some of the other distributors. And so they were a good fit for us and really a partner with us in helping to grow the brand in the Lincoln area.
Yeah. And so you guys have continued to grow, and now you have award-winning cider.
Yep. Last year at the U.S. Cider Championships, we were named the grand champion. We had 3 gold medals, more than any other cidery, and we were also the youngest cidery ever to be named the national champion.
Because you've
people like Woodchuck and others have won it, and they attributed the fact that we were such a young cidery to win it to our winemaking skills, that because of the history we'd had ahead of that. So my son had been making wine from 2008 to 2014, so he was a very skilled winemaker. And so we had a lot of quality controls, and we have the equipment and the science behind it that we could make a consistent product.
And you do. You guys deliver every single time. Every single time I try it, it's the same, and it's still fantastic. And I think that's a really interesting lesson to take away from this episode, is the fact that, things didn't work out with SRI. And so you went and created measurement systems. Okay. And it was pretty close, though. It wasn't too far off of the beaten path. And then, things with measurement systems kind of go by the wayside a little bit. And then PenLink fires up. And then, PenLink, you kind of like won in that. And you say, okay, I want to try this wine thing out on my quote retirement, right? And then, you guys get a devastating frost that completely knocks you down. And you say, oh, we should just try this thing that's just like right next door, cider. And look at the success. I find it interesting about how you parlay your success into the next thing, or you parlay your failure into your next 5, 10x, 20x larger success. That seems to be a common thread with you for some reason. Yep. Do you have any idea why that is?
I don't know. I think from an entrepreneurial standpoint, the commonality is you're always looking for that void that someone's not filling, and try to be the first one in that market and have the best product in that market, and then you can kind of control your destiny. So with PenLink, we were the first software product that worked with anybody's pen register devices and provided that common database platform to do analytics. Nobody else was doing it at that time, so that gave us a big runway. The Lincoln system was the first,
Right.
Our cider, not the first, but it was the first
Early.
in Nebraska. And so that was, again, my son said, cider in 2014 was the fastest growing liquor segment at like 11% growth nationally a year. And so we're like, why not? Nobody else is doing it in Nebraska, And so it's, and it proved to be true. I think, those first few years we did a few thousand gallons. Last year, I think we did 87,000 gallons of hard cider. We did 5,000 gallons of wine. So
5,000 gallons of wine is all.
And 87 of cider, and we surpassed last year's numbers a month ago. Within a quarter to go. Yeah.
You have a quarter to go, and you've already beaten last year's numbers of 87,000 gallons. So I think that's a great reminder, is that, your smallest product might become, your mainstay. And I think Google spends a lot of time with that, right? You have 20% downtime to focus on whatever side project. I think it's 20%, right? 20% downtime to focus on whatever you want to do as a side project. And there's tons and tons and tons of side projects that have came to Google by people being bored or what they're working on just isn't really working. So they want to try this little side hustle project, and it ends up being huge. And so I think there's a lot to that. And how many of those 5,000 gallons of wine are sold because of Fermented Fridays, because of people coming there for cider, is my question. Because it's got to be a high amount, right?
Yeah, I mean, we move a lot of wine at both of our locations, at our event center out at the winery, and then our cider house and tasting room in Ashland.
Right.
But again, it's really hard to grow the wine brand. I think James Arthur is the biggest, and without going and looking at numbers, they're 10 to 14,000 gallons a year, but they've been at it since the 90s,
Oh yeah, you guys are.
And then I think Max Creek is number 2, right behind them, around 9,000-10,000. Everybody else that's having success is around 5, 6, 7,000 gallons. But it's hard to move that needle, because there's just too much competition.
Right. This helps though.
Right.
Having the cider that be as successful as it was. I remember going to Fermented Fridays and looking at your big wine selection and be like, oh, that's really cool. Those bottles look really fancy, and something I would like to have. And so I'm definitely looking forward to getting some of that now. So what do you recommend as like something similar to a cab?
We do 2 dry red wines. So when someone says a cab, typically they want a full-bodied dry red wine. Mm-hmm. And so our Marquette, our Chamberson, and then we have a blend called R, stands for red. Those are all dry red blend, oak-aged wines.
Gotcha. So I'm going to kind of finish up with some rapid fire questions for you here, Mike. What advice would you give to anybody that wants to go into entrepreneurship, whether it be software or winemaking or a cidery? What sort of advice would you give to them as they get started?
Don't quit. Mike Hayes told me early on in my first year being on my own, if it was easy, everybody'd be doing it. Mm-hmm. And so that's always stuck with me, that, it's not easy to be an entrepreneur, and you have to be persistent. You have to, have that type of work ethic that I'm not going to fail. If I have to work 7 days a week, if I have to work 24 hours a day, that's what I'm going to do. Mm-hmm. And I did that a lot. I can tell you many times flying home at midnight, looking down at Lincoln or Omaha and all the lights. Everybody's at home in bed. It's like, and I'm still flying home trying to get home.
Mike's still working.
So I would say persistence, number one. You need to have your eyes open and be ready to adapt or change. Mm-hmm. That what you set out to do many times is not necessarily where you're going to find your success. It's going to be something tangent to that.
Tangent to success. That's what we talked about, right?
Yep.
It's not necessarily what you're laser focused on right now. It's probably going to be something that's just around the corner with that. And I completely get that.
Yeah. I mean,
I've seen it with my own ventures.
Yeah. You have to be focused on the plan you're trying to execute,
right.
But you have to be open-minded enough to know at some point that might not work and you might have to change. Are you willing to change?
Right. And so say it does keep working, but there's something better. That's a really interesting piece too, is because you have to be available to those sort of changes, and you have to be willing to say like, oh, we may have not done that 100% right the first time, or there might be something better out there that we should continue to try.
Yeah. And I'd say the final piece is, and I've always said this too, your number one resource and biggest asset is your people. Mm-hmm. So if you don't select good people, if you don't surround yourself with good people, if you don't treat people right, you won't make it.
Yeah. That's great advice. What book changed your life?
Megatrends.
Yeah, that's an easy one. What other ones maybe later in your career?
That's
such a great one though.
I'm not a real big book reader. I know you'd asked questions about mentors before. A more recent mentor and book I've read, a couple books are from Jim Cramer on
Mm-hmm.
Mad Money. So he's got 2 or 3 different books. I tend to read autobiographies about people, whether it's Andrew Grove from Intel. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mostly read journals and shorter article things because it just takes me too long to read a book.
Yeah. That story about Andrew Grove with Intel is very interesting. I just read a book, blanking on the title right now, but it talks about the process that he implemented. Man, I'm kicking myself for not remembering that. But basically, this guy went and worked with Andrew Grove and understood how he led his teams, and because the Intel war of the microprocessor war was very real. Mm-hmm. And he talks about how they would constantly have to ideate and make things better, faster, stronger all the time. And some task and something, I'm blanking on that, but I'll probably think of it as soon as we cut the episode. But that's a great story of the story of Intel. So if you guys are looking to learn a little bit more about that, phenomenal story.
Yep. So I read, what was it? Little Kingdom, which was about Apple. And when Scully took over, and then kind of the downfall of that. But yeah. Yeah,
there's a lot of interesting books, and I appreciate you coming on here today, Mike. This is really cool to see how you can start off by getting sued as a 26-year-old to, fast forward several years in your business career to having several successful companies. I think it's really cool that you, and now you have a product that I hope when people hear this that they can enjoy and know a little bit more history about, one of the co-founders of the cidery and where this all came from.
Keep on drinking it. That's all we ask.
He's like, I don't care what we think about. Yeah. Guys, that's going to wrap it up for another episode of Spark to Fire. I'm your host, Landon Rhodes. And one thing I want to leave you guys with is please screenshot this when you're listening to the podcast. Take a screenshot of the podcast and then tag at Life of Landon and at Spark to Fire podcast. That's how we grow, is when you guys share this content. So please continue to share this content with people that you know so we can keep getting great guests on and we can continue to provide that value and get more interesting people in here to share. Thank you so much for coming on today. I appreciate you, Mike.
Thank you.
And you guys keep striking.